Welcome to Resting Places, Learning Spaces, the podcast where we explore cemeteries, memorial spaces, and more, and the lessons they hold for history, memory, and education. I'm Dr. Hilary Van Dyke, and for the first episode of season 2, I wanted to slow things down and look back before moving forward. So, season 1 was a season of exploration, new sites, conversation, and honestly, for me, some new ways of thinking as not just an educator, but as a researcher. Today, I'm joined by my educational contributor, Michelle Anderson.
Hello.
To reflect on what I learned through season 1, what themes kept surfacing as well. So, how are you doing?
I am doing great. I am so ready to have this conversation.
Yes. One thing I will say is that season 2, we have some video so that, because before season 1, the YouTube was just like the photo cover of the episode floating a little bit with the audio. So the reason there's video is just to make the YouTube part more dynamic.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because I have a software now where I can edit video and have audio from it, because that was why I didn't have both.
Right.
I was like, I'm not editing two.
Yeah. But people get to see the closet.
Yes, it's beautiful. All right, so let's get into it. What we're actually doing for this is I presented at a conference called Oral Histories with the Dead. It was a virtual symposium. And I applied. I was like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna talk about the themes from season 1 of my podcast. No big deal. And maybe I was supposed to read something somewhere that I didn't. But I got in and then learned that I had to write a 6,000 to 8,000 word paper, which is 20 or more pages. So as a part of being in this symposium. And then our presentations, they did it as just lots of panels throughout the day where it was 4 people, 15 minutes each, and then a Q&A.
So what happens with your essay now? Is it being published?
So the goal is to publish like a book that has all these things in it. So
you just helped them write a book.
Girl.
Well done.
Girl. Oh my gosh. So what this episode is going to actually be is getting into just the section. So not all 20 pages, y'all, don't worry. Just the section that was about the themes particularly, and then kind of a little chunk of thinking about the what's next stuff. So that also means that you had homework.
I did.
Where I sent you just that section. So I am gonna go through it and kind of like read. What I would like is if you just interrupt me and
I'm not an interrupter by nature.
Okay.
But I will do my best.
Yeah. So any of the places that you had some notes or thoughts, just stop me and then we'll talk through it.
Will do.
But my cross-episode themes illuminate how cemeteries function not only as repositories of the past, but as active sites of meaning-making for schools and communities. So here's the 4 things that I found. 1, they create historical agents out of everyday people. 2, they force an encounter with absence. 3, they showcase how aligned all of mankind is, no matter where they originate. And finally, they serve as powerful sites of teaching and learning.
And my response is yes.
For sure.
Yeah.
So thinking about the first theme, cemeteries transform ordinary individuals into historical agents.
And I would add there, historical agents, yes, but also community leaders.
Yeah.
So all of these people did not have the intention of being a leader in their community, but they certainly became one.
For real.
Yeah.
The stories that surface repeatedly challenge the notion that history only belongs to prominent figures, monumental events, or official archives. On one hand, the sites hold stories and lives shaped by migration, labor, activism, faith, survival. There's so many more things that could be on that list, but on the other hand, the actual interviews themselves showed how these everyday people that were caring for the spaces themselves were actual historical folks.
Yeah, and historians, historical interpreters, social leaders. And what I really enjoyed thinking about, just even within this paragraph that you just shared with us, is to think about what it really does mean to be a community, and how many communities we have within a community, and how that just builds, especially for our students, if we help them see that, that within communities you have these smaller communities that all have different areas of focus and reasons for coming together, but if we help students think through that, I think what we're also doing is help them find their different communities, which we know they need because we know the struggles that they're having. So it helps them develop an identity, a purpose, and that feeling of belonging that hopefully carries them through these most challenging years.
Ooh, I'm doing the thing that kids do where they click the.
There's
So one example of this idea of these individuals being transformed into historical agents is at Whispering Soul African American Cemetery. I interviewed the nonprofit leaders, and in that conversation, they shared hidden histories of African American residents buried in the cemetery who would traditionally not show up in formal archives. Additionally, the labor to preserve the cemetery that the nonprofit leaders did made them into historical agents. And then similarly, when you see that Memorial Park episode, in that we hear these stories of the people who were buried in the cemeteries, so lots of untold histories there, a lot of people who wouldn't show up in an archive traditionally or in a history book. But then the actual preservationist herself and the work she was doing and the people working with her were doing made her into a historical agent. And even down to where in both situations, they actually fought to have historical markers put up so that people would learn about them. And then here you just see these two not two, because with Whispering Souls it was three. And then Memorial Park Cemetery is mainly the one, but also the folks around her that weren't necessarily being interviewed. All these people become stewards of public memory.
And what I love there is that each person had a different entry point into the work. There was something that spoke to them that drew them in. So even though they're working on this common goal, it all hit them differently and made them care for different reasons. And I think, too, that's really important for our students to see and to be thinking about, because we do want them to understand that a community doesn't have to be all like-minded.
Right.
That we can, even within our communities, we can have differences and not to sound cliche, but our differences make us stronger.
Yeah.
And so I think, especially in these early teenage years where they're trying to figure out their identity, they're trying to figure out how they belong, and they don't want to be different. Like that is the thing that they don't want to be.
Right.
They don't want anyone to see them as different. But I think that's where this can be an important lesson too.
Yeah. Another one, when we were thinking about episode 6 with Rosie Grant and the Ghostly Archives episode.
So
Still my favorite. So in her project, she's recreating these recipes from the gravestone inscriptions. But then we've got these individual stories that get connected to culinary practices, and then all that gets connected to remembrance. So you kind of move away from the sadness of it all into a more joyous experience while you're learning all this stuff about these people. And then because she's made this book, now they're in a history book.
Yeah.
Like none of them would have been in a history book without the work that she was doing.
Yeah, no, I love that it's promoting healing. It's helping people work through their grief and focus on the positive things that they loved about their loved ones, the things that they loved about their family members and friends, and just how to keep that forefront.
Right. So we have like that kind of set of episodes where the work that the people are doing are making them into history points, but also surfacing stories into history points. But then there's the other side of things where maybe we're talking about a site that has a really well documented history. And so within that, I think what I also was noticing then is there becomes a conversation on who counts as history. And some of the work that we did, I think, was actually reshaping a little bit like whose story we're going to tell.
Right.
So just an example of that, the National Mall episode, I talked about the site in general in DC, but the focus was really on how marginalized communities were actually super important to that place's history, from how it was started to the people that have visited over the years up to historical events as well.
Well, and how those people, even during their lifetime, they were visible, but they were invisible.
Yeah. Episodes beyond the US also activated this theme. So thinking about the Cape Coast episode, one of the things that I reflected on was how the guide curated our experience. And as much as I know about the slave trade, and I know a lot, it's even for me shifted how I understand and see the slave trade. A lot of that is because we really felt throughout the tour like the presence of these long forgotten and long gone people were really with us as we learned about their inhumane treatment they received while they were at Cape Coast Castle.
And I really appreciated when you were in that space and as you were reflecting on that space, how you had someone, you had these people that took you to locations where you're going to have an emotional response, but they gave you that space and they gave you a form and function for your feelings so
Yeah.
that it wasn't just devastating.
Right.
It gave it a purpose and a drive to help you work through it.
Yeah. It somehow was triumphant in the
Yeah.
end, which is wild considering like what we were learning about.
Yeah.
These examples showcase a different consideration of who counts as history, and through these encounters, these places position all individuals, so not just leaders, as subjects of history whose lives shape the social world. Beyond just the who counts, these episodes also help me further expand what I learned about the particular subjects that I just would not have learned in the pages of a history textbook.
Yeah, and I think this is a good space to have the quick story of not story, but the quick conversation of micro history and macro history. How you can use micro history to have a better, more fuller understanding of the macro history. But it's important, when you use these stories of individuals to help give you insight into a time period, that you are careful not to overstate
Right.
the one person's story or use that one person's story to try to speak for everybody. But we do know that students are more engaged when they have personal stories to connect to time periods or topics.
Right. So, a second cross episode theme is the way these conversations force an encounter with absence. So, here again, on one hand, cemeteries are places of presence because you've got all these things that are like marked and visible and tangible. So, you've got the graves, monuments, rings, rails. But then on the other hand, they're equally defined by what is missing. So much of the conversations, unmarked burials, if there are like headstones, some of them deteriorated, names erased, and incomplete records. But here for the paper, I focus more on the incomplete records part of the conversation because it really makes preservation difficult. And one example in the Whispering Souls African American Cemetery episode, Laura Kepner, she ended up in that project because she wrote the book, and she talked about the difficulty of researching for her book because historical newspapers mainly only covered negative stories about Black residents. And then outside of that, they really weren't mentioned very often. And at the end of the episode, when you and I were talking, you were thinking back on that one project we did where we literally, if it wasn't for that like record about how many kids were at the school, wouldn't have known from this specific newspaper that White people were even in that community at all. And then it's funny in this paper that I'm like quoting you, then now I'm like talking to you. But
but it makes me, when we're talking about these absences, we've had people that have pointed these absences out to us so that it's always that, well, what else don't I know?
Right.
What else am I missing?
So another type of absence discussed, of course, was unmarked graves, which was an issue in Whispering Souls, which I mean mostly is an unmarked grave cemetery, but then also Memorial Park Cemetery. And then when we talked to Dr. Jackson, this came up a lot in the African American Burial Grounds and Remembering Project. With that project specifically, that's just a very prevalent absence across the country when you're talking about historical Black cemeteries. In these three episodes, particularly, that absence was the result of like historical forces of inequality, displacement, and then kind of neglect eventually from the community of just like ignoring the cemetery. Not ignoring, I don't think that's the right word, but like letting the cemetery go.
Yeah. So what I was really struck with in that episode was the realization of the pattern and understanding that this is across states and across communities.
Right.
So, and that's what we do when we study history is we're looking for patterns, and then that becomes an area of focus and an area of study. And so I do wonder then, will this become, we'll just keep going because now that, which is both great and then also, to me, a little bit sad is that it had to be neglected and a pattern had to be found for it to be studied.
Right.
But will this then still be a driver moving forward?
A driver of
study and a driver of care and community activism.
Hope so.
I do too.
All right, so absence showed up in other ways in the episodes as well. So thinking about Cape Coast episode, we discuss absences like the kidnapping of millions of people who were displaced from their homes. And then that displacement, of course, down the road leads to countless diasporans bereft of historical and cultural knowledge. And then not to mention of what the loss of so many people did to the homes that they left behind. Like we
And
have no way
right.
really understanding that.
No, and that is another area of study specifically in history is in these mass atrocities and these mass catastrophes when communities are left bereft of people, how they cope and
Mm,
how they fill in those gaps as best they can. And so you can study different eras, whether it's the bubonic plague in Europe where what like a
right.
third of the population was just gone. And I know because people do have those conversations about what happens to communities when so many people are just suddenly gone. How
Mm,
do they work through that? I know that's where a lot of people's minds went with COVID,
yeah.
as that started happening. Was if this becomes another mass atrocity, what is that going to look like for
Right.
us? And that I think drove a lot of the anxiety
Mm.
that we experienced, along with the loss.
Yeah. In the episodes, of course, they're not all strictly cemeteries. So when we think about like the Thailand Spirit Houses episode that showed absence differently, here people are really using the spirit house to acknowledge spirits they want blessings from and ancestors who are gone. And then finally, with the Stonehenge episode, I was struggling with, and we were kind of laughing about how unclear Stonehenge's true history was because as you put it, so we have no idea about a lot of what was happening there because there are no written records. So in that episode, we were discussing the fact that part of history includes reckoning with what we can't fully recover, but then there's also this beautiful educational opportunity to learn not only how historians interpret what they do have, but also the fact that interpretations change over time. And so I think in this way, we're sort of inviting listeners to sit with ambiguity and being okay with that instead of like neat resolutions.
And I love that. I love how you put that because there are very few things when we study history that we put absolute meaning to.
Right.
And those tend to be, of course, the huge atrocities again, because we know that as our culture changes and things shift and time passes, that our understanding will change too.
Yeah.
Our understanding of the past and how we relate to it will change too. So just knowing that where we're sitting right now,
Mhm.
everything, well, no, not everything makes sense, but very few things actually feel like they make sense. But where we feel like we're making meaning out of historical events, just
Mhm.
knowing that that too will change over time.
Right. So the third theme that I saw across the episodes is just that mankind is aligned in the need to acknowledge death in some way. In the Thailand Spirit House episode, you said humanity, we have a lot in common no matter where we came from. And I think that was very evident in this me thinking about this theme. And for one, whether we're like communing with spirits for courage in front of a spirit house in Thailand or in a slave dungeon in Ghana, that idea of like reaching out beyond beyond the like physical world seemed very universal.
For sure. And I think to go along with this theme is understanding that as humans, we are very creative. And part of that creativity is in creating moral codes and spiritual life because we're just ultimately trying to understand what's the point of it all.
Yeah.
And so to see across cultures that everybody is wrestling with that means it is a universal for humanity. And that gives me a lot of, I don't know, faith in humanity
Yeah.
that whichever way we happen to be going through that journey, we are all trying to seek and make sense out of what we're doing here.
So these episodes showcase, again, like I said, the interconnectedness of mankind. In Thailand, where Buddhism is the main religion, but then the practice of using spirit houses was combining all these other things. So it's animism, Hinduism, Taoism, and superstition. The practice is super widespread. So it wasn't just like something from your home, but it was like in front of businesses and more. So like huge chunks of this society has accepted this like practice that was a mixture of all these different and other people's like practices came together for
Mhm.
something that is now just what they do. In the National Mall episode, you were noting how many of the monuments were influenced by great monuments around the world. So even like in the Washington Monument, how that is basically an obelisk,
Yeah.
which originates from ancient Egyptian culture.
And
So even in how we
yeah.
like do the thing, we're borrowing from other parts
Yep.
of the world. What were you about to say?
No, I was just so I was interrupting. That was a place I should not have
No,
interrupted.
no, you can interrupt whenever.
No, I was just thinking. So yes, so then the Washington Monument is an obelisk, which takes us back to Egypt. But then Jefferson, Lincoln, and most of our government buildings are classical, so harkening back to Greece and Rome. So the thing to note there, I think, is that we are harkening back to the past. But in the United States, it tends to follow that we're harkening back to Western civilization themes.
Right. In the Cape Coast episode, we were also reflecting on the fact that transatlantic slave trade involved so many corners of the world, and then thought about tools to help students understand that, especially since a trip to Ghana
Not
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 likely.
likely. And also, I wouldn't want to be a teacher taking students
No.
into the slave castle.
Oh
would-
no,
Yeah, yeah.
no. But yeah, for sure. There's just it's so yes, this need to acknowledge death and our past
Yeah.
folks seems pretty universal.
Mhm.
But then there are just all these other ways that we could see the interconnectedness. So that brings us to our final theme, which basically pretty obvious theme, I think,
Mhm.
because it's kind of the whole point of the podcast. Basically, that place is a dynamic learning tool. So across episodes, participants emphasize that cemeteries offer learning opportunities that extend far beyond social studies content alone. Every episode, we include a discussion dedicated to thinking about the implications. That's what you're here
I
for.
know. This is where
My
I really fit in.
educational contributor. But then even beyond like our kind of post-episode conversations, whenever it made sense, if I was interviewing someone, I would ask them like, how do you engage with students? Or, how do you see the future? Whatever. Not the future, but the future generation.
Mm.
And how do you see them like interacting with or caring with your project? And then I think it's interesting too that like the Ghostly Archives thing, that exists now because of a school project,
Yeah, that's so
right?
great.
So like just the way that a assignment from a teacher actually has led to
Yeah.
now her publishing a book, likely publishing a second book.
Right.
I was like, girl, if you get a TV show, I want to be on one episode,
So I love that. Of course, I love the fact that this is all
Yeah.
connected to education, because that's where I live. But some of the things that we also talked about in terms of how this fits in a classroom was discussions around what topics or ways that teachers need to have some care
Mhm.
when they're bringing it into the classroom so that they don't overstep lines and cross into places that could be harmful to students.
Right, 100%. And I actually think we need to remember that more too,
Mm.
because I don't know that I always remember to say that in every episode. Maybe some of the episodes more obvious, and you're like, listen,
Yeah. No, that when we were talking about Stonehenge, I don't think we went into any
Right.
places where we were
Yeah.
overstepping any boundaries there. I think actually maybe the tour guide did that himself when he brought up the aliens. I
Yeah.
don't know. But in places where, with my lens that I
Yeah.
always have to be looking through when when we were talking about spirit houses and just saying no, we don't want students trying to appropriate
Yeah.
cultures and belittling them in some way because of that, even though it might have be out of good intentions.
Mhm.
So just making sure that when it's clear that we
Right.
should be having those
Right.
conversations.
Okay. Also, I think within this theme of just it being a good learning tool
Mm.
is this idea that all these sites are places where history gets humanized, especially as we're thinking about all the story buried in them. Like I already just said a bit ago, Memorial Park Cemetery, Whispering Souls. We talked about all these different stories and barely scratched the surface
Yeah.
too on the stories there. In the Memorial Park episode, the interview with Miss Eileen, she noted, I just liked her quote where she called cemeteries walking museums.
Yeah.
So the history students can learn from cemeteries or any of these places is invaluable. But in considering the role of place-based education and civic preservation, these episodes are also helpful in that. So again, the Memorial Park Cemetery, Whispering Souls, African American Burial Grounds and Remembering Project, they show this civic engagement piece. And so In the Memorial Park Cemetery episode, she talked through all these things that they did to stop it from being lost to a developer, which included showing up to city government meetings, holding the mayor and city council of Tampa accountable for letting the land be sold in the first place. And then at the end of that episode, you stated that Miss Eileen and her counterparts were proof that, quote, it is on us to make sure our government is working the way we want it to.
Yeah, we are the watchdogs
Yeah.
for our government, but we also are the impetus for change.
Right.
So if we want our government to do something, it's not going to just do it. We have to
some
step
humans
in.
pushing. Yeah. And then in the African American and Burial Grounds Remembering Project, Dr. Jackson talked about similar efforts to preserve cemeteries. And I would say with hers, some of it is more or less like preserving history too. So not just ones that are still around, there's also so many buried under stuff that they're even advocating for that type of cemetery. And she talked about the fact that she worked with Representative French's Driscoll in Florida to actually pass legislation. So in 2023, House Bill 49 was passed for abandoned historic cemeteries, which requires the Historic Cemeteries Program to provide grants for certain entities to conduct research, repair, restore, and maintain abandoned African American cemeteries. So that's like the pinnacle, right? You passed the law. Yeah. That whole conversation too, and this next one is what led to, unfortunately for you, this other project. We'll let you all know if that gets, we'll talk about that some other time. Yeah. So, and then in the Whispering Souls episode, the work that Hayes, Kepner, and Claudio do can teach students two things: the power of primary sources, but also, again, the power of civic engagement. They used primary sources a lot in their work. For example, Hayes, who actually was a descendant of the cemetery, she learned that she was a descendant because of what's on the deed.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Like she knew
the community.
Yeah. But like she was like, oh, not only is he like buried here, he was already part of this. And that's the original deed that she learned that from. And then Kepner, she published the book about the folks buried in the cemetery, and she used a lot of primary sources, but even things like the patent of one of the residents, and through that learning about this inventor that's buried there. And here's the line. Actually, remember I was saying I couldn't remember what it was. This is the line. Okay. So one of the things you said that has since prompted another project that I have roped Mrs. Anderson into.
The roping was not necessary. It was willingly.
But just this quote, you said, the work at Whispering Souls was a great case for how individuals hold their government accountable. And then also what they're doing is really, quote, civics in action because of the many steps they took to restore the cemetery, gain land ownership, engage in maintenance, collaborate with the city for things like tree planting, getting a historical marker, putting up a fence, recruiting volunteers, working with a local university for ground penetration radar, and even like connecting a community member to the cemetery. She didn't realize her dad was buried there. And so, all of that.
What we are frequently trying to do in social studies classrooms, what we have to do on a daily basis, but is frequently a struggle, is probably how I should word it, is to help connect students to the concepts. So it is one thing to just learn that these are the steps in the process, but to give them something relevant and timely and in their community just is going to make that work connect so much more easily for them.
Yeah. So the last thing I'll just say, when you think about this idea of place-based education, in the Cape Coast Castle episode, the guest I had when we were talking through the experience, she said, we experience history, when she was describing what it was like to walk the paths of our ancestors. So there just simply was no way that we could have fully appreciated the knowledge we gained without such an immersive experience. And that powerful feeling is possible in these spaces that invite interdisciplinary inquiry while also fostering reflection, empathy, and critical thinking.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that. That is powerful and perfect.
Yes. All right. Normally, I do like an expert interview. So I just have a couple of questions for you because you are the one. I'm saying normally. A lot of times I do an interview with someone, but today it's going to be you.
Okay.
But I just have only like 2 questions, so I'm not going to stress you out. You've had a front row seat to the thinking behind this podcast. When you look back across season 1, what do you see as the most significant takeaways?
So in terms of how I hope I've helped is in a better understanding of even standards-based education.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to, because of the role that I have to always ensure and make sure I'm clear with teachers that our instruction has to be standards-based,
Right.
but that doesn't mean that you cannot be learning about these
Right.
things. But it means um, it's even more important to really understand your standards because and like fully and in depth
Mm-hmm.
understand what those standards are, because this does all fit and it is relevant and important. And if teachers don't have that deep understanding of their standards, then this becomes something, well, I just don't have time for
Right.
something like
Right.
that. But no, 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 this is
Yeah.
how you teach. The standard is through this. So we have to be standards based education, but we are not told how to teach the standards.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is where I believe the creativity in teaching comes in, and why our teachers that love writing curriculum and love that planning piece is because they understand that, and
Mm-hmm.
they have that creative mindset of, okay, so this is what the standard says, but how do I teach that?
Right.
And there's all these different ways that I can do that, and this is a really meaningful way to do that, where we can help correct some of those wrongs that
Right.
have happened.
Agreed. I like it.
Yeah. Another really important theme I think has come across clearly is the importance of community.
Mm-hmm.
That none of this is happening, especially with cemeteries projects. None of that is happening without community
Right.
involvement. And so it, in many cases, may have been sparked by one person, but it was that one person who had the knowledge of something and had that drive for something,
Mm-hmm.
but then found the others too that had
Right.
um, the same feeling about it, so that they were willing to do everything that it took
Mm-hmm.
to make sure that um, that the needs were met.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the community piece.
Yeah.
I do think that fits into the civics in action
Hmm.
thing because so much of that collaboration was like tied into that the fighting,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
fighting for what's right.
Right.
But from your perspective as an educator, what do you think listeners might not even have realized that they've been learning during season one?
Well, I hope that they were learning just how complex our standards are, so that they have the ability to incorporate all of these different ways of learning,
Hmm.
because they are complex and they allow for that work. Um, and that the whole purpose of doing it is to, again, help our students build connection to their own community
Hmm.
and to make relevance between what they're learning in the classroom and what's happening outside.
So, in K 12 settings, resting places, learning spaces, I think, I hope, offers an entry point for teachers and pre service teachers to consider how to implement curriculum that extends beyond textbooks and traditional archives. It provides a model for engaging place based and cemetery based education as rigorous standards aligned practice. In fact, I actually assigned one of these episodes as homework in my secondary methods course to my pre service teachers while they were working on a cemetery based education project.
And
Um,
we are working here on how to begin to have some of these conversations to build into curriculum materials for our students.
Okay. And
Mhm.
I'll say one thing that was funny at the beginning is all of the students were like, what the heck is this? And by the end, I'm not going to say 100% of them were like, okay, I'm going to do cemetery based education, but I would say 100% of them were like, I am going to figure out how to use my community in
Mhm.
teaching. I
Yep.
was like, bet.
Yeah.
I'll take it. And finally, community partnerships further extend the possibilities of how to make this sort of education work. Educators, caretakers, local residents become co-educators in making meaningful experiences for students. So I think in this way, this podcast makes the case for the pedagogical value of place-based education.
Absolutely.
In conclusion, I'll say I learned a lot from this self study of season one, self study I got kind of forced into, which of course that was the plan, was to come up with the themes, but it wasn't going to be necessarily as like academic per se as it ended
Right.
up having to be. And the greatest thing I'll say for my biggest realization has been the idea of what is a resting place and learning space,
Mhm.
or what could be one, and particularly in considering absences.
Yeah.
And I'll say I realized this while participating in the What It Was walking tour in downtown Tampa. I was doing that tour for something unrelated to this podcast, but I was like, in the throes of writing the paper and had that on my mind. And so tour leader Jamila Davis took us through a historical timeline and painted vivid imagery of Black people who were pioneers, business people, enslaved people, and more in Tampa. And then throughout the tour, we passed a variety of historical markers, but none of them were, like, not a single one. I think technically one in front of a church, but otherwise none of the markers had anything to do with anything we were learning. And that to me was really sad because it was such cool history we were learning. But she created this tour using primary sources like deeds, wills, newspaper articles, and more.
Well,
And
it reminds me of the walking tour in St. Petersburg.
yeah,
And when I've done that with you and with some others, that you had with you some of those primary
Right.
sources to show. So you're standing in a location and you can make that
You can see
immediate
it.
connection.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that is sad is that if you don't go on this tour,
Yeah.
you're not going to learn this stuff.
Right.
Right. And so she created a learning space out of this void.
Mhm.
So wasn't necessarily the sort of thing I thought about when I was thinking about this podcast, Resting Places, Learning Spaces. But I was like, yeah, no, this is Resting Place, Learning Space. But in this case, it's like the histories, they're just hidden
Right.
without her.
Yeah. Well, for me, one of the things that I feel like I really learned was just, I'm going to fangirl. It was in the African American Burial Ground and Remembering Project that it was just so clear how in this one group's work that all the domains of my discipline came together. And so that for me was so powerful. And it is for me a call to action of how can I make sure we're doing that in the materials that our students have access to.
Yes, I like it. So looking forward to this season 2. Of course, I plan to continue shining light on local stories in Tampa Bay and Florida at large and the US and the world. But I have scheduled an interview with Davis about that tour. So we will get to hear from her. And then just really understanding how she made something out of a glaring absence. I also hope to interview another author. We'll see though, because I don't know if I have time to read. But wanting to see, someone whose work highlights a cemetery or something around cemeteries. And then of course, so in all episodes of season 2, I will of course examine memorial practices across all of these contexts, but then at the same time continue to try to inform the work of developing place-based, cemetery-based curriculum for pre-service teachers and teachers. I hope this podcast remains a structured opportunity for educators to consider place-based learning as a core component of their practice.
And I hope that you always continue to include how to do this if you can't do the field trip.
Yes.
But at the same time, I hope that is inspiring teachers to seek out field trip opportunities for their students. So no, you can't go to the ancient Roman ruins, but where in our local community can you take students to do some place-based education?
And we've got some of
We
these.
We do.
Through this podcast, I invite the world into my classroom and research focus in this audio classroom, and I guess sort of video, depending on how you watch it or listen to it. I believe that cemeteries and podcasts, when brought together, create a mutually reinforcing practice of learning from the dead. Before I wrap up, is there anything else you want to add?
I think because of the goals of the podcast, which include the stories that we're hearing, people are coming to terms with mortality and what may or may not come next, but just trying to find some semblance of peace within their lifetime of that eventuality. And I think that is very important that we try to destigmatize death as appropriately as we can, which I think in ways that are appropriate in a classroom are to talk about resting spaces and how, what happens to us, even if it is if we're studying war, and of course then we're talking about battles and we're talking about deaths, like what happens to those soldiers after the battle is over. So just that understanding that it is, the eventuality and that it's part of how we live our lives.
Right. Well, that wraps up this episode of Resting Places, Learning Spaces. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love for you to share it with fellow educators, travelers, or anyone interested in the intersection of history and place. You can follow me on Instagram at Professor Van Dyke to continue the conversation or recommend a topic. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and remember, every resting place has a story to tell.